The sky above the sacred battlefield was cold, even when no winter came. In the hidden plains of the Mahabharata, where wars were remembered as living light, the winds moved like silent watchers, and every banner, chariot, and broken spear seemed to wait for a sound that never arrived. Above all of it, the mantras that held the cosmos in balance began to fade, one by one, as if some unseen hand was covering the universe with frost. This was not a small omen, and everyone who felt it knew the same terrible truth. If the sacred chants went silent completely, Dharma would weaken. The order of right action would crack, and the worlds would fall into a still and frozen ruin. In that bright but fading place stood Arjuna, a man of duty, a warrior of unmatched skill, and a son of the royal line who had always carried the weight of choice on his shoulders. He was brave, but he was also human. And he wanted one thing more than victory. He wanted to know that his fighting still served the good of the world. Beside him appeared Krishna, calm and clear-eyed, a guide, a friend, and the voice of wisdom who understood the hidden roads between duty and doubt. Krishna did not come to win the battle for Arjuna. He came because the battle could only be won by a heart that understood why it was being fought. He told Arjuna that the frost was no common storm. It was a curse born from broken vows. And it had spread because a traitor had learned how to silence the inner fire of warriors. That traitor was Vance, once a keeper of sacred rules, now a man who had turned his mind against balance. Vance believed that endless war had cursed the world, and he had decided that the only peace worth having was a peace without motion, without desire, and without struggle. To force that cold order on all creation, he had gathered an armored legion forged from iron vows. Soldiers who had sworn themselves so tightly to obedience that their armor had become part of their bones. Their purpose was simple and cruel. They would spread the frost, shatter the mantras, and force every soul into silent submission. If Arjuna failed, the hidden plains would freeze, the great war of meaning would end, and the worlds would no longer know courage, growth, or choice. Krishna placed a hand on Arjuna's shoulders and pointed toward the DIST Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Wait. The horizon of the hidden battlefield split with pale white light, and a path appeared where no path had been before. There, the first fragment of Dharma waited, buried inside a tower of glassy frost. Arjuna took a breath, lifted his bow, and stepped forward with Krishna at his side. Their first trial came quickly at the Gate of Echoes, where the frost had already wrapped around ancient stone and locked every prayer inside its walls. The air was sharp enough to sting, and the ground was lined with cracked cymbals that once sang with power. As Arjuna and Krishna entered, the armored legion rose from the mist like a wall of metal and silence. These were not wild fighters. They moved in straight lines, locked together by vow and fear, and their faces showed no anger at all. They believed they were saving the world by ending its freedom. Their leader, a broad man named Thorn, wore a black helm with silver edges and carried a shield marked by frozen rings. He spoke in a voice that sounded like ice sliding across stone. He said that choice had only brought pain and that Vance had shown them the mercy of stillness. Arjuna answered with steady eyes and a firmer heart. He said that mercy without freedom was only another chain. Then the battle began, not as a storm of cruelty, but as a clash of wills. Arjuna moved with speed and grace, his arrows cutting through the frozen air, while Krishna watched every opening and guided him with quiet words. Yet every time Arjuna struck down one line of soldiers, two more took their place, their armor locking together like a cold wall. Then the frost reached for Arjuna himself. A pale wave touched his chest, and for one frightening moment his muscles tightened and his thoughts began to slow. He heard the first whisper of obedience, a voice promising rest if he would simply stop resisting. Arjuna almost yielded, because the promise of no pain and no doubt can feel sweet when a heart is tired. But Krishna called his name, not loudly, but with the kind of certainty that cuts through fear. He reminded Arjuna that duty was not a chain, but a living promise to protect what must remain alive. Arjuna broke the frost with a surge of will, and in that instant he saw the truth inside the enemy ranks. These soldiers were not monsters. They were warriors whose souls had been numbed by the traitor, and their silence was a wound, not a choice. That revelation changed Arjuna because he stopped seeing only an army in front of him. He began to see frightened people trapped inside iron and cold. So instead of destroying the legion, he aimed for their frozen shields, their binding marks, and the runes that held their obedience in place. One by one, the cold links cracked. Some soldiers stumbled back in shock as if waking from a long dream. The Gate of Echoes fell open, and beyond it lay the second fragment of Dharma, glowing faintly beneath a river of pale light. Deeper in the hidden plains, the world became stranger and more dangerous. Vast fields of broken chariots stretched into the dark, while above them the heavens showed thin cracks like white veins across a blue glass sky. Each crack leaked more frost, and each breath Arjuna took grew colder. Krishna explained the deeper truth as they moved. Long ago, the fragments of Dharma had been scattered so that no single hand could bend righteousness into tyranny. Each fragment held a different part of balance, one for courage, one for mercy, one for truth, and one for restraint. Vance had not merely stolen power. He had tried to collect order itself, believing that if he controlled every rule, he could end all suffering by ending all freedom. That was his motive, and it was twisted, but it was also understandable in a sad way. He had watched war, grief, betrayal, and chaos, and he had decided that a frozen world was safer than a living one. Arjuna listened carefully because understanding an enemy can be more dangerous than fearing one. They crossed a bridge made of shattered blades where the wind carried faint voices from forgotten vows. Then the traitor finally revealed himself in full. Vance stood on a platform of black ice, wrapped in a robe of silver frost, his eyes calm and empty in the way of a man who had crushed his own doubt. Beside him rose the frost crown, an ancient device of ritual cold that could silence the inner mantra of any soul it touched. Vance told Arjuna that Krishna was leading him toward pain, and that the universe would be kinder if all motion ended. Then he raised one hand, and the heavens answered with a deeper crack. The third fragment of Dharma shivered somewhere below the frost, and Arjuna understood that time was running out. He rushed forward, but Vance did not meet him with panic. He used the frost crown to reach into the minds of the armored legion and tighten their silence, turning them into a frozen wave. The soldiers moved together with terrible discipline, forcing Arjuna back step by step. Krishna then revealed the final, most painful truth. Vance had once been one of the keepers of sacred chant, trained to protect the mantras of balance. He had been chosen for wisdom, but he had become afraid of the world's endless conflict. His betrayal was not born from greed alone, it was born from fear, and fear had hardened into a law that could freeze other souls. Arjuna felt that truth like a blade of cold water. He realized that if he answered fear with anger, he would simply feed the same frozen order. So he stopped fighting the way Vance expected. He lowered his bow, closed his eyes, and listened to the silence inside the storm. In that still moment, he remembered every teacher, every vow, every innocent life that depended on courage remaining alive. Then he spoke the lost rhythm of Dharma, not as a command, but as a promise that balance could hold both mercy and strength. The sound was small at first, but it spread through the cracked heavens like warm light returning to a dark room. The frost crown trembled, the armored legion paused, even Vance stepped back, shocked that the silence had been broken from within. Arjuna had not yet won, but he had opened the door to a deeper truths. The final challenge waited above them, and the hidden battlefield was beginning to wake. Above the shattered battlefield, the sky stayed split open, and cold light poured through the cracks like water through broken stone. Below that broken sky, the frozen ground glowed with pale lines, while the air carried a strange stillness that felt heavy and sacred at the same time. Arjuna stood at the center of that silence, a heroic man with dark brown hair, an athletic build, ornate golden armor over a deep blue battle robe, and a sacred bow held steady in his hands. His glowing arrows rested in a bright quiver at his side, and his calm face hid the strain that burned behind his intense eyes. Beside him stood Krishna, a wise man with dark black hair, flowing yellow and deep blue robes with gold trim, and a serene expression that did not shake even under the pressure of the frozen heavens. They were not alone. Ahead of them stood Vance, a villainous man with white hair, cold, pale eyes, black and silver armor covered in frost patterns, and a rigid build that made him look carved from ice. In his hand, the frost crown shone with black ice and silver rune lines, and its pale frost glow still hung in the air like a threat. Around him waited Thorn, a heavy armored man with gray hair hidden under a black helm with silver edges, a large shield marked by frozen rings, and a face that showed nothing at all. He led the armored legion, and those soldiers stood in tight ranks because they feared the crown, feared Vance, and feared what would happen if the silence ever broke. That fear was the heart of the problem. The frost crown had been made to silence mantras, freeze courage, and trap warriors in obedience, and if it kept working, the hidden battlefield above them would stay sealed forever. That meant no truth, no balance, and no way home for the sacred power that was trying to return. The small sound Arjuna had spoken a moment before did not fade. It grew, it moved through the cracked heavens, touched the frozen ranks, and made the frost crown tremble harder in Vance's grip. Krishna watched with quiet focus because he knew the sound was not magic alone. It was a choice. It was Arjuna refusing to let fear define the world. Vance saw that too, and his cold control cracked for the first time. He tightened his fingers around the crown and snapped at his soldiers to advance, but the legion did not move as fast as before. The silence had been damaged from inside, and every man there could feel it. Thorn raised his frozen shield and began to march forward in stiff, heavy steps, his duty clear even if his heart was not. He wanted order because order had once saved him, and now he believed only the crown could keep the battlefield from falling apart. Vance wanted something darker. He wanted the battlefield sealed because he had built his power on stillness, fear, and control. The fragments of Dharma, hidden within the broken light above, threatened to end his rule. If courage, mercy, truth, and restraint came together again, the crown would lose its hold, and Vance would lose the army that followed him. That motive made him dangerous because he was not fighting to win one battle. He was fighting to keep a false world alive. Krishna stepped half a pace forward, and his calm voice carried farther than any shout. He did not tell Arjuna to strike blindly. He reminded him that mercy without courage becomes weakness, and courage without mercy becomes ruin. Those words settled into Arjuna like a steady hand on the shoulder. For a moment, the young warrior understood that the fragments of Dharma were not simply objects to collect. They were truths to live by. One fragment pulsed with courage, another with mercy, another with truth, and the last with restraint. Together they formed a balance that could hold both strength and gentleness without breaking either one. That was why the crown feared them. That was why Vance feared them. He had built his rule on only one thing, and that one thing was cold control. As Krishna spoke, the sky above them rumbled, and a new shape began to appear in the broken light. It was the first sign that the hidden battlefield was waking. Pieces of black stone rose from the frozen air, turning slowly like gates opening in a great temple. Between those stones, glowing seams of gold and blue appeared, and the air filled with the sound of distant drums. Arjuna looked up and saw that the final challenge was not just Vance. It was the choice to enter the battlefield with a whole heart, not a divided one. He drew one glowing arrow and pointed it not at a man but at the space between fear and truth. Then he released it, and the arrow struck the broken sky. Light burst outward, and one of the sacred fragments answered. The fragment of truth began to fall. Vance recoiled, his pale eyes wide with anger and shock, because he had expected power to crush Arjuna, not understanding to lift him higher. The frost crown flashed violently, and a ring of frost raced across the battlefield, freezing the ground in jagged waves. Thorn lifted his shield to protect the nearest soldiers, and the legion braced as the cold wall slammed into them. No one was harmed, but several ranks were forced back, and the formation shattered for the first time. That break mattered. It showed that Vance was no longer in full control. Arjuna moved before the lines could close again, his golden armor catching the pale light as he crossed the frozen ground with quick, certain steps. Krishna remained behind him, not as a shield but as a guide, because this battle was about more than sword and bow. It was about knowing when to act and when to wait. As Arjuna moved, the truth fragment spiraled down through the cold air and hovered above his open hand. It looked like a broken crystal shard made of radiant light, gold at its center, blue at its edge, and white within the core. The instant he touched it, a memory rushed through him, not of victory, but of the cost of ignoring balance. He saw people obeying out of fear, then turning on each other when fear broke. He saw strength without kindness becoming cruelty, and kindness without strength becoming helplessness. He understood then that the fragments were scattered because the world had forgotten how to hold them together. That was the hidden wound in the battlefield, and it was deeper than Vance. The revelation changed everything. The frost crown had not only silenced the soldiers, it had also fed on the fear that balance was impossible. Vance had used that fear to make himself seem like the only stable thing left. He had told Thorn and the Legion that mercy would weaken them and that truth would tear them apart. That lie had kept him in control. Now it began to fail. Thorn turned his helmet slightly toward Vance, and for the first time there was a pause in his rigid stance. He had followed orders because he believed chaos would come without them, but the shards of Dharma showed a different path. Krishna saw that pause and gave Arjuna a single nod because the next step had to be made by choice, not command. Arjuna raised his bow again, and the newly awakened truth fragment hovered beside him like a second light. He did not fire at Vance. Instead, he aimed at the frost crown itself because the real enemy was the silence trapping everyone inside the lie. Vance shouted and lifted the crown high, forcing a storm of icy light into the air. The battlefield shook. The black stone gates above opened wider. A vast shape stirred in the hidden sky, and everyone beneath it felt the weight of what was coming. Arjuna held his ground, his face calm, his body steady, and his heart no longer divided. He knew this was only part 2 of the journey, and the final battlefield was waking with them. So he drew one more breath, ready to answer the next wave, while Krishna watched the sky and whispered that balance had finally begun to rise. The battlefield was still shaking when the next wave began to show itself, and the cold wind moved like a living thing across the broken ground. Above the fighters, the black stone gates stayed wide open, and their edges glowed with a dim, icy light. In the hidden sky beyond them, the vast shape moved again, slow and heavy, as if a giant hand were waking under deep water. Arjuna stood in the center of that harsh silence, a heroic man with dark brown hair, ornate golden armor, and a deep blue battle robe, holding his sacred bow with steady hands. He was no longer the same man who had once hesitated between duty and doubt, because this place had forced him to choose what he truly was. Beside him stood Krishna, a wise man with dark black hair, flowing yellow and deep blue robes, and a calm face that never lost its peace. Krishna had guided Arjuna through fear, and now he watched the sky with careful eyes because he understood the true danger better than anyone else. The problem was simple and terrible at the same time. If the frost crown reached its full power, it would silence the sacred mantras that held balance together, and the whole battlefield would fall into frozen control. That was why the stakes were so high, because this was not only a fight for one warrior or one army, but for the order that kept courage, mercy, truth, and restraint alive in the world. Then the first frozen ranks stepped out from the broken mist, and the cold made their armor shine like dull silver glass. At their front rode Vance, a villainous man with white hair, cold pale eyes, black and silver armor covered in frost patterns, and a stern face that never softened. He carried the glowing frost crown in one raised hand, and the crown sent out pale frost light in clean waves that crawled across the ground. Vance did not attack out of simple anger, and that made him even more dangerous because his motive was clear and logical. Long ago, he had learned that warriors could not be controlled while they still trusted their own inner voice, so he wanted to freeze every strong heart before it could rise against him. He believed silence was safer than choice, and order was stronger than compassion, so he had built his entire war around the idea that a quiet world would never betray him. Walking beside him was Thorn, a heavy armored man with gray hair, a black helm with silver edges, and a large shield marked by frozen rings. Thorn was broad, rigid, and emotionless, a commander who led the armored legion with exact steps and no wasted motion. He mattered because he was the one who made Vance stronger on the field, and because every soldier behind him trusted his hard discipline more than they trusted their own hearts. When Thorn lifted his shield, the frozen rings on its surface flashed, and a wall of cold force rolled forward like a crushing tide. Arjuna watched that wall come toward him, and the fragments of Dharma in the air around him began to pulse, as if they recognized the danger and wanted to answer it. The first clash came fast, but it was not a wild clash of weapons because this war was shaped by will as much as steel. Arjuna drew one glowing arrow, and the bow in his hands seemed to brighten as he held his breath. Then he released the shot, and the arrow flew with a sharp line of gold light, striking the front of the frozen wall and breaking it into drifting shards. The force did not end there, because 3 more arrows followed, each one carrying a different sacred tone, and each one moved toward a different weakness in the enemy line. One arrow struck a shield and sent the soldier behind it stumbling back. Another arrow cut through the frost mist and opened a path through the center of the rank. A third arrow rose high, where it split the cold haze and revealed the vast shape in the sky for just one clear moment. Everyone saw it then, and the sight made even the hard soldiers tighten their grips because the shape was not a storm or a mountain or a cloud. It was a giant sealed presence, something ancient and awake, waiting behind the gates like a hidden judge. Krishna stepped forward half a pace and raised one hand, and his calm voice carried through the noise with surprising strength. He told Arjuna that the shape above was not the enemy itself, but the pressure left behind by a broken promise, and that Vance was using the frost crown to keep that old seal from opening in the right way. This was the first real twist in the struggle because the gates were not opening to release pure destruction. They were opening because something sacred had been locked away for too long, and Vance feared the truth that would come when it finally emerged. He wanted control so badly that he was willing to freeze the world before he let it change. Arjuna did not fully answer with words because the battlefield demanded action, and he moved like a man who finally understood his role. He shifted his stance, protected the fragments of Dharma with his body, and fired again, this time aiming not at the soldiers but at the crown in Vance's hand. The arrow struck the frost light and the frost crown flashed in pain before Vance pulled it back with a hard, angry motion. A wave of cold burst outward, and several warriors on both sides felt their knees lock for a moment as the silent force pressed against their resolve. Yet Arjuna held steady because Krishna's teaching had changed the deepest part of him. He now knew that strength was not only force but also patience, and not only victory but also the choice to stand for what could not be replaced. That change mattered because this was the moment his heart stopped chasing proof and started living by purpose. Krishna saw that change and nodded once, not in pride but in quiet approval because the lesson had taken root. Then the fragments of Dharma floated higher around Arjuna and their light became easier to see. Courage burned gold, mercy glowed soft blue, truth shone bright white, and restraint held them all together like a careful hand. The shards had been waiting for a bearer who would not use them for power, and now they recognized Arjuna as that bearer. Vance noticed the light, and for the first time his stern face tightened with real fear, because he understood that the balance he had tried to bury was beginning to rise inside the one man he could not easily silence. Thorn answered with a heavy forward march, and the frozen rings on his shield expanded into a wide barrier that pushed the legion behind him. His job was simple, and that made him frightening because he existed only to break openings and protect Vance from direct challenge. The shield crashed against Arjuna in a storm of cold force, and the impact drove him back several steps across the shaking ground. But Arjuna did not fall, because Krishna moved beside him and touched the air with 2 fingers, sending a thin line of golden calm through the frost. That small act changed the whole shape of the moment, because the cold barrier cracked just enough for Arjuna to slip through and strike the edge of Thorn's shield with the flat of his bow. The shield spun, the frozen rings shattered into pale dust, and Thorn was forced to retreat, still upright but no longer in control of the front line. At the same time, Vance lifted the frost crown higher, and a deeper layer of cold spread toward the gates above. The hidden shape in the sky stirred again, and this time the movement was stronger, almost like a giant turning in sleep. Krishna looked up, and for the first time his calm face held a trace of concern, because he realized that Vance was not only trying to win the battle. He was trying to force the sealed presence to awaken in pain, hoping that shock and fear would make it obey him. That plan would have made the whole world unstable because a forced awakening would not bring balance, only chaos. Arjuna understood that instantly, and it gave him a new kind of focus. He stopped fighting to push back the army alone and instead began protecting the center of the field where the Dharma shards floated brightest. The battle was no longer about holding ground, it was about deciding what kind of world would be allowed to open. Then the sky cracked with a deep sound, and a narrow beam of pale light slipped through the black gates from above. The beam touched the fragments of Dharma, and the shards answered at once, each one spinning faster and shining stronger. Arjuna felt their power pull toward him, not as a weapon but as a test. Courage asked him to stand without fear. Mercy asked him to protect even those who had fought against him. Truth asked him to see the battle clearly, without lies. Restraint asked him to win without becoming like Vance. Those 4 demands were hard, and that was why they mattered. Arjuna lifted his face, and he finally understood the full shape of the journey ahead. He was not meant to destroy the frozen force, but to restore the broken balance that had been trapped behind it. Krishna saw the understanding in his eyes, and his voice became gentle as he said that the final battlefield was not a place, but a choice. Vance heard those words and snarled for the first time because he knew the truth had slipped beyond his control. He drove the frost crown downward, and a burst of cold surged across the field, swallowing the nearest soldiers and forcing both armies apart. The wave did not end the fight, but it raised the danger higher than before, because the next moment would decide whether the hidden presence above would awaken in harmony or in ruin. Arjuna drew one breath, steady and deep, while the glowing shards of Dharma circled closer to his hands. Krishna stood at his side, ready to guide the next step, and the vast shape in the sky slowly opened one eye of light. The battle had not ended and the gates had not finished their rise, but now the path forward was clear enough to challenge the darkness, and the story was only beginning to reveal what waited beyond the frozen veil. Frozen battlefields stretched under a dark sky where broken ice plates shimmered like glass and pale wind moved between the shattered gates. Above it all, the huge shape in the heavens held still for one long breath, while one glowing eye stayed open and watched every soul below. Arjuna stood at the center of that cold world, his dark brown hair lifted by the wind, his golden armor catching the faint light, and his sacred bow held steady in both hands. He was not there for glory, and he was not there for revenge. He was there because the world had begun to crack, and if the wrong force won this war, the balance of the cosmos would freeze into silence. Krishna stood beside him, calm and bright in his flowing yellow and deep blue robes, his dark black hair resting smoothly against his shoulders, his face still gentle even as danger closed in. He knew what Arjuna was facing, and he knew why it mattered. If the hidden power above woke in fear, it would bring ruin. If it woke in harmony, it could become a guide against the darkness. That was the central fight now, and every sound of metal and ice below them pushed the story toward that choice. The four glowing shards of Dharma moved around Arjuna like loyal stars, each one carrying a different sacred truth. One shard held courage, one held mercy, one held truth, and one held restraint. They had been scattered by the spreading frost of Vance, the cold ruler who wore black and silver armor covered in hard frost lines. His white hair flashed under the frozen light, and his pale eyes never softened because he had built his whole life around control. Vance did not want chaos, and he did not want war for its own sake. He wanted a world where every strong feeling could be locked away, because he believed fear and pain were the roots of every conflict. In his mind, the frost crown was mercy. In reality, it was a prison. The ancient crown of black ice and silver rune lines rested in his hands, and its pale glow spread through the battlefield like a wave that tried to silence prayer, silence courage, and silence every will that resisted him. Behind Vance stood Thorn, a heavy armored man with gray hair hidden under a black helm edged in silver. He carried a huge shield marked by frozen rings, and he led the armored legion with rigid steps and an emotionless face. Thorn did not speak much, but his silence mattered because he was the one who made Vance's strategy real. If Vance was the cold mind of the enemy, Thorn was the wall that kept the army moving. Together, they had pushed the frozen war to this edge, and now they wanted to stop Arjuna before the sacred shards could become whole. Krishna raised one hand and his voice moved through the wind like a clear river. He told Arjuna that the next step was not to strike first, but to listen. The eye above was not yet an enemy and not yet an ally. It was a vast power bound to the frozen veil, a guardian form held between awakening and ruin. Krishna explained that the frost crown had done more than freeze the field. It had also wounded the old harmony that held the sky together. Long ago, the crown had been made by minds that feared change, and they used it to force order on a world that needed balance instead. That was why the shards of Dharma had awakened now. They had answered a deeper need because courage alone would not be enough. Mercy would stop Arjuna from becoming like the enemy. Truth would show him what was hidden. Restraint would keep his power from breaking the very thing he came to save. Arjuna listened with his calm face, but inside he felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He had faced battles before, yet this one felt larger than his own life. He could already hear the low chant of the enemy army below, cut off and broken whenever the frost crown pulsed. That silence was the enemy's greatest weapon. It did not just freeze bodies, it tried to freeze choice. Then the first real clash began. Thorn raised his shield and drove the legion forward through the ice mist, and the soldiers behind him moved in stiff, hard lines. Their armor scraped against the frozen ground, and their spears made a pale forest in the cold light. Arjuna stepped forward at once, not with anger, but with purpose. He drew one of the glowing arrows from his quiver, and the fragment of courage answered his hand. The arrow shone gold and blue, and when he aimed, the air around him grew sharp and clear. Krishna did not fire for him. He never took away Arjuna's own strength. Instead, he guided the rhythm of the moment, telling him when to hold, when to release, and when to trust the space between breaths. Arjuna released the arrow, and it struck the front line of the legion with a burst of bright force that cracked the ice under their boots. Several soldiers were forced to retreat, their formation broken for the first time in the battle. Thorn did not flinch. He slammed the base of his shield into the ground, and frozen rings spread outward in a wide circle, trying to trap Arjuna in place. The ground locked around Arjuna's feet, and the next breath felt smaller than before. Above them, the giant eye in the sky blinked once, and the whole battlefield trembled as if it had felt the same pressure. That was when Arjuna understood the real danger. The battle below was only one layer. The awakening above was already reacting to every choice made on the ice. Vance saw the opening, and he smiled without warmth. He lifted the frost crown high, and the silver runes burned with a brighter cold. At once, the silence spread harder, and the sacred chants that had been rising in Arjuna's heart began to fade. Even Krishna closed his eyes for a short moment, because the crown was built to attack not just sound but inner resolve. Vance spoke clearly then, and his words cut through the storm. He said that the world did not need freedom, because freedom only led to pain, greed, and endless struggle. He said that if every strong heart could be frozen in perfect calm, then no one would suffer from choice ever again. That was his motive, and it was deeply twisted, but it still made sense in a cold way. He had once watched a world torn apart by fear and selfish power, and he had decided that the only answer was to remove the part of people that could resist control. Arjuna heard this, and for one moment he almost understood the temptation hidden inside it. If pain could be removed, then perhaps the war could end. But Krishna stepped closer and spoke softly, reminding him that a world without choice was not peace. It was only stillness. It was only a cage painted like a gift. Arjuna felt the truth of that in his chest, and the fourth shard of Dharma, the shard of restraint, floated to the front of the circle around him. It glowed white, and the ice around his feet began to loosen. The hidden presence above answered at last. A deep light poured from the single open eye, and the frozen veil in the sky split into long, glowing lines. From that break came a shape of immense scale, not fully a creature and not fully a storm, but something ancient that had waited for the right balance to appear. The battlefield below fell into uneasy silence, because even Thorn and the legion could feel that they were now standing under a power greater than their war. Arjuna raised his bow and did not rush. He understood now that the final answer was not brute strength, it was balance made visible. He placed the shard of mercy near the shard of courage and the shard of truth beside restraint. The four fragments circled together, and their lights mixed into one clear, steady radiance. Krishna nodded, because this was the moment he had prepared Arjuna for from the beginning. The hidden power in the sky was not waking because it had been commanded. It was waking because the right harmony had finally been offered to it. That was the surprise hidden inside the whole battle. Vance had thought control would create order, but his frost had only made the awakening incomplete and angry. Arjuna had not come to dominate the power above. He came to speak to it through balance. The eye in the sky widened, and the frozen gates beneath it began to open faster, as if they recognized the shape of truth. Vance, now truly afraid, ordered Thorn to crush the circle before it could finish. Thorn charged with his shield lifted high, and the legion rushed with him in a hard wave of steel and ice. But Arjuna was different now. He was not only a warrior with a sacred bow. He was a man who had learned that courage without mercy could become cruelty, and truth without restraint could become ruin. He let Krishna guide his timing, then released 4 arrows in a single clean rhythm. The arrows carried the light of the 4 shards, and they struck the frozen rings around Thorn's shield, breaking the trap that had held the field in place. Thorn was driven back several steps, his legion stumbling behind him as the ice web beneath them shattered into bright shards. Vance raised the frost crown one last time, but the crown now flickered, because the harmony above had begun to weaken its cold grip. Arjuna could see it clearly. The crown drew power from fear, and fear could not survive long in the light of truth. Yet the battle was not over. The giant figure in the sky had opened more than one eye now, and its glowing form was lowering toward the battlefield with a force that could change everything. Krishna placed one steady hand near Arjuna's shoulder and told him the next step would decide whether this awakening became a guardian or a disaster. Arjuna tightened his grip on the bow, looked up into the falling light, and stepped forward without hesitation, while the frozen gates rose behind him and the war moved into its next, unknown turn. The frozen battlefield held its breath as the glowing figure kept falling from the sky, and the cold wind carried the sound of cracking ice across broken stone and bent steel. Behind Arjuna, the frozen gates rose higher with a heavy roar, their surface shining with pale frost and old warning marks, while the dark army below paused in fear and confusion. Krishna stood close beside Arjuna, calm as ever, with dark black hair flowing against his yellow and deep blue robes, and his quiet eyes watched the sky as if he could already see the next turn of fate. Arjuna, a man with dark brown hair, strong shoulders, and ornate golden armor over his deep blue battle robe, kept his sacred bow raised in both hands, his glowing arrows waiting at his side, while his face stayed steady even as the air around him grew sharp with danger. Everyone on the field understood the central problem now, because the sky being had awakened with more than one eye, and if it fell without purpose, it could crush both armies and shake the balance of the world. Vance had wanted that chaos from the start, because the white-haired man in black and silver armor believed that fear was the fastest way to rule, and he had brought the frost crown to silence prayer, freeze courage, and force every warrior to bow. The crowd of soldiers did not know yet whether the sky being would become a guardian or a disaster, but Krishna knew that this moment would decide far more than the shape of the battlefield, because it would decide whether Arjuna trusted force alone or learned the deeper power of restraint. The glowing figure lowered until its shape became clear against the storm light, and the battlefield saw a vast presence made of silver fire and pale blue light, with eyes opening one after another like waking stars. It did not strike at once. Instead, it hovered above the ground as if listening. That silence made the fear worse because the army could feel its power without knowing its purpose. Thorn, the heavy armored commander with gray hair hidden beneath a black helm edged in silver, tightened his grip on the large shield marked by frozen rings and stepped forward with rigid precision. He led the armored legion not because he loved war, but because Vance had promised him order in a broken land, and Thorn believed that peace could be built only if every voice was forced into one shape. Around him, the legion marched in tight lines, their armor coated with frost patterns, their boots grinding through ice as they raised their shields against the falling light. Vance himself stood on a broken ridge, tall and still, his cold pale eyes fixed on Krishna and Arjuna with a sharp hate that made his face harder than stone. The frost crown rested in his hand, glowing black ice with silver rune lines, and the crown sent out a thin wave of cold that made some soldiers clutch their heads, because it could silence mantras and choke the will before a blade was even lifted. Vance wanted the sky being to crash into the battlefield because he believed any divine force could be used if it was trapped first. He had no patience for balance, mercy, or truth. He wanted a world where only his frozen law survived. Krishna understood that plan at once, and he spoke without raising his voice, telling Arjuna that the enemy was not only in the sky, but also in the fear that was spreading through every heart on the ground. Arjuna did not answer with words at first. He studied the sky being, then Vance, then the legion, and he felt the weight of all three threats at once. His breath stayed even, but inside he was fighting a harder battle than any clash of steel, because he had always believed strength meant standing firm and striking true, yet now he saw that strength also meant knowing when not to strike. Krishna noticed the change in him and began to explain what mattered most. Long before this war, 4 sacred fragments of Dharma had been split apart to keep balance safe from greed. Each shard carried a different truth: courage, mercy, truth, and restraint. As long as those 4 pieces stayed apart, no single ruler could bend all of balance to one cruel purpose. But Vance had hunted them for that very reason, because he knew that if he gathered them, he could twist the balance of the cosmos and turn even noble power into a frozen chain. Arjuna finally understood why the sky being had mattered so much, because it had answered the call of the fragments, and its power would reflect the heart of the one who reached it first. If Vance reached it, disaster would spread. If Arjuna reached it with a clear mind, the awakening could become a shield instead of a weapon. That truth changed the field. It made the battle larger than a simple attack. It became a trial of character. Then Krishna lifted one hand and sent a line of gold light forward, and in that same instant the first fragment of Dharma rose from the cracked earth near Arjuna's feet, shining with bright courage. The shard floated into the air like a small star, and the soldiers nearby gasped, because they could feel hope wake up inside them. Vance reacted at once. He slammed the frost crown downward, and a wide ring of cold spread across the battlefield, frosting shields, armor, and stone in a single breath. The legion surged behind that wave, while Thorn moved as a wall of iron, his shield catching the first burst of glowing energy that Arjuna released from his bow. The clash did not bring blood or ruin, but it drove sparks of ice and light in every direction, and the ground trembled under the force of it. Arjuna stepped forward instead of back, and each step made the golden armor on his chest catch the divine glow from above. He drew one glowing arrow, then stopped. Krishna had taught him that the right shot was not always the fastest shot, and Arjuna now saw that the cold crown could not be beaten by anger alone. So he lowered the arrow slightly and aimed not at Vance, but at the space between the frost wave and the sky being, where the pressure of both forces was crushing the battlefield. That choice surprised everyone. Vance frowned because he expected a direct attack. Thorn held his shield tighter because he could not predict a move that was made from restraint instead of rage. Then Arjuna released the arrow, and it split into 4 beams of light in the air, each beam reaching toward a different direction around the battlefield. The second fragment of Dharma answered the call and rose from a broken banner pole, shining with mercy. The third appeared near a fallen gate hinge, burning with truth. The fourth stirred deep inside the ice near Thorn feet, glowing with restraint. The fragments did not fly to Vance. They gathered around Arjuna instead, and that was the great revelation of this part, because the balance of the cosmos did not choose the loudest warrior. It chose the one willing to hold power without being ruled by it. The sky being began to change as the 4 fragments circled Arjuna and Krishna, their light forming a steady ring that pushed back the frost crown wave. The giant presence above the battlefield opened all its eyes at once, not in rage, but in recognition, and its descent slowed, then steadied, as if it had found a true witness on the ground below. Krishna placed his hand near the air beside Arjuna's shoulder, not touching but guiding, and he told him to speak with the light instead of the sword. Arjuna understood then that the fragments were not weapons, but a test. Courage without mercy would become pride, mercy without truth would become weakness, truth without restraint would become cruelty, restraint without courage would become fear. Those 4 parts had to stand together or nothing could stay balanced. With that insight, Arjuna raised his bow high and called out in a clear voice that carried across the frozen field, asking the sky being to stand as guardian and not as disaster. The figure above paused, then lowered one hand toward the ring of fragments, and its light softened from a harsh glare into a bright, steady glow. Vance saw his control slipping away, and for the first time his cold face cracked with frustration. He pushed the frost crown harder, trying to smother the light, but the crown began to crack along its silver lines because it had been built on force alone, and force could not command true balance. Thorn saw the crown weaken, and he hesitated because the rigid order he had trusted was suddenly exposed as brittle. The legion behind him began to falter. Some soldiers lowered their shields. Others stared at Arjuna with growing doubt. Krishna watched all of it with a quiet, almost sad expression because he knew the deeper battle was still not over. Vance was losing the field, but he was not finished, and the part of the sky being had now begun to awaken with purpose, not as a servant of anyone, but as a force that would demand a final choice. As the ring of sacred light expanded, Arjuna stood in its center with a calm face and burning eyes, no longer just a fighter, but a man ready to carry balance itself into the next part of the war. The frozen battlefield stretched wide under a dark sky where broken stone, shattered shields, and drifting frost made the world feel silent and heavy. Above it all, the ring of sacred light kept growing, and its bright edge lit the snow like a burning circle of dawn. In that cold glow, Arjuna stood very still, his dark brown hair shining under gold armor, his deep blue battle robe moving in the wind, and his sacred bow held low but ready. He was not just a fighter anymore because the battle had turned into a choice that could shape the fate of the whole field. Beside him stood Krishna, a calm man with dark black hair, flowing yellow and deep blue robes, and a serene face that never showed panic. Krishna was there as a guide, and he knew the true danger was not only Vance, but the way fear could bend the heart of any warrior. Far across the ice, Vance stood with cold pale eyes, white hair, and black silver armor marked by frost lines, while the frost crown in his hand pulsed with pale light. He wanted every voice on the field to go silent, because he believed that a world without noise, doubt, and resistance would be easier to rule. That was why the problem mattered so much, because if Vance could freeze the will of the warriors, then no one would be able to defend balance, truth, or mercy. The stakes were simple and frightening because the battlefield was not only a place of war, but the last wall between order and total frozen control. The sky being rose higher as the sacred ring widened, and its form changed in ways that made even the armored soldiers stop and look up. It had a tall body made of pale blue and white light, silver white glowing hair, and many bright eyes opening across its face and upper body. Frost mist drifted around it, but holy sparks flashed through the cold, and the being did not move like a servant anymore. It moved like a judge that had finally awakened. The sky being had watched the clash from above, and now it had decided that the time for blind commands was over. It wanted truth, not control. It wanted balance, not fear. That was the first clear sign that the war was changing, because even a divine force was refusing to remain trapped inside Vance's plan. Vance saw this, and for the first time his stern expression tightened with real worry. He had built his power on the Frost Crown, an ancient ceremonial crown of black ice and silver rune lines, and he had used it to silence mantras and freeze the will of warriors. But the crown had always carried a hidden rule. The stronger the silence it created, the more it pushed back against any force that carried true balance. Krishna understood that rule long before Vance did, and he watched the sky being with quiet focus, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. Then he turned to Arjuna and said in a calm voice that every force has a limit, and every command can break when the heart behind it is false. Arjuna listened because he trusted Krishna more than anyone on the field. He looked at the 4 glowing fragments of Dharma that hovered near the sacred light, each shard bright with gold, blue, and white energy. One shard held courage, one held mercy, one held truth, and one held restraint. Arjuna had already earned courage in battle, but now he needed the other 3, because this enemy could not be overcome by force alone. If he attacked with anger, he would only become another tool of violence. If he hesitated too long, Vance would spread the frost wave again and cover the field in silence. Then Vance lifted the frost crown high, and the air cracked with cold pressure as a broad frost wave rushed forward. It slid low over the ground like a pale wall, freezing stone, armor, and every loose shard of ice in its path. The armored legion moved with it, a rigid group of stern soldiers in dark iron armor and closed helmets, their heavy shields and spears locked in perfect formation. Thorn, the broad-shouldered commander with gray hair hidden under a black helm edged in silver, stood at their front like a stone tower. His face was emotionless, and his large shield, marked by frozen rings, caught the pale glow of the wave as he drove the legion onward. Thorn was not a man who loved this war. He mattered because he obeyed without question, and that made him dangerous. He believed order was stronger than feeling, and Vance had used that belief to make him a weapon. The frost wave reached the sacred ring, and for one hard moment it pressed against the light like a great cold hand. The ground shook, the air stiffened, and the sound of the battlefield nearly vanished, yet the sacred ring did not break. Instead, it brightened. Arjuna felt the pull of the fragments of Dharma, and he understood the twist that Krishna had been leading him toward. The sky being was not awakening to serve him or Vance, it was awakening to choose. That meant Arjuna also had to choose not simply a target but a path. He raised his bow, and one glowing arrow formed in his hand with a clean white edge and a golden core. Still, he did not fire at once. He looked past the wave, past the legion, and straight at Vance, because he finally saw the deeper wound beneath the enemy armor. Vance was not trying to win a battlefield. He was trying to freeze his own fear of chaos. He had lost trust in people, and he believed that if he could silence everyone else, then he would never have to face that fear again. That was why he clung so hard to the frost crown, and that was why he kept pushing even after the field turned against him. Arjuna felt a small shift inside his chest. He had come here ready to fight, but now he saw that true strength had to include mercy, even for a dangerous enemy. That did not mean letting Vance win. It meant refusing to become like him. Krishna stepped forward, his yellow and deep blue robes glowing in the sacred light, and he raised one hand toward the sky being. The divine figure answered with a slow turn of its many eyes, and the whole battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Krishna spoke with clear words that carried across the snow. He said the time for forced silence was over, and that balance could only live if every force could choose its own nature. The sky being listened, and then it turned its gaze toward the frost crown. At once the crown began to tremble in Vance's grip, as if it had heard a law older than his command. Vance gritted his teeth, and for the first time his cold, pale eyes showed open anger. He tried to pour more power into the crown, but the silver rune lines on its surface started to flare unevenly. The frost wave surged again, yet the sacred ring of light rose to meet it, and the two forces locked together in a fierce glow of blue, white, and gold. Arjuna saw the opening, but he also saw the choice. If he struck with all his power, he could break the wave, but he might also shatter the crown in a way that would scatter its frozen force across the field. If he held back too much, Vance would recover. So Arjuna breathed in, steadied his heart, and drew on the fragments of Dharma in the order Krishna had taught him. Courage gave him motion, mercy gave him patience, truth gave him aim, restraint gave him control. Then he released the arrow, and it flew not like a weapon of rage but like a message of balance. The arrow struck the center of the frost crown, and the crown burst with a sharp flash of white frost and sacred gold. Vance was forced back several steps, his armor scraping the frozen ground, and the frost wave collapsed into drifting mist. The armored legion wavered for the first time, their formation bending as Thorn raised his shield in a useless attempt to hold the line. Yet even in defeat, Vance did not fall. He caught himself, lifted his head, and stared at Arjuna with a look that was no longer only anger. It was fear, and that made him more human but not less dangerous. The Sky Being then made its choice, and that choice changed the battlefield without ending the war. Its bright eyes opened wider, and from its luminous body came a pure field of pale light that covered the frozen ground in calm, steady glow. The light did not destroy the Legion. It did not punish Vance. Instead, it separated the forces on the field, breaking the crown's silence and restoring the sound of breathing, armor, and distant wind. For the first time in the battle, the soldiers could hear their own thoughts again. Some in the armored legion lowered their spears in confusion, and Thorn stood still, as if his empty face had finally met a question he could not answer. Krishna looked at Arjuna with quiet pride because he could see the change in him. Arjuna was still strong, but now his strength had shape. He no longer wanted victory for its own sake. He wanted a world where power served balance and not fear. Vance, however, stared at the broken glow in his hand and understood that he had lost more than a weapon. He had lost his claim over the Sky Being, and he had lost the easy lie that control could protect him forever. Yet the story was not over, because the Frost Crown had only fractured, not vanished, and the Sky Being had not chosen a side. It had chosen a law. That meant the next part of the war would demand something even harder than battle. Arjuna had won this moment, but he knew the deeper trial was still waiting ahead. As the sacred light settled around him, he lowered his bow, kept his eyes on Vance, and stood ready, calm and unshaken, for the next choice that the frozen world would demand. The frozen battlefield stretched wide under a dim sky, and every ridge of ice caught the pale light like broken glass. Soldiers stood in heavy ranks, their shields locked, their breath turning to mist, while the air itself felt sharp enough to cut through fear. At the center of that silent ruin, Arjuna stood with his sacred bow lowered, his dark brown hair brushed by frost wind, his golden armor shining against the cold, and his deep blue robe moving like a calm wave in a storm. Beside him, Krishna remained still and clear-eyed, with dark black hair, yellow and deep blue robes, and a presence so steady that even the cold seemed to hesitate near him. Across the broken field, Vance held what remained of the Frost Crown, his white hair bright against black and silver armor marked by frost patterns, and his cold pale eyes fixed on Arjuna with anger that had turned into something even more dangerous. This was no longer a simple clash of armies, because the Frost Crown had fractured, the Sky Being above them had not chosen a side, and the next trial would decide whether the frozen world would fall into silence or rise into balance. Vance was the one who had started this war by stealing the crown from the old vault beneath the glacier city, and he had done it for a reason that made him cruel, but not foolish. He believed the world was breaking apart because too many voices fought for power, so he wanted one rule, one will, and one frozen law that could silence all doubt. The Frost Crown answered that wish by freezing mantras, slowing courage, and turning people into obedient shadows of themselves. Vance did not simply want to rule, he wanted to stop change itself, because change had once cost him everything he trusted. That fear had hardened into hunger, and his hunger had pulled the armored legion into battle. The soldiers under Thorn, a broad-shouldered man in black helm and silver-edged armor, marched with emotionless faces because they had been trained to trust only cold order. Thorn himself did not speak much, but he believed Vance offered the only path that could keep the frozen land from collapsing into chaos. That made him dangerous because he was not driven by rage but by loyalty without question. Then the Sky Being above the battlefield moved for the first time, and the whole field seemed to hold its breath. Its tall, luminous body glowed in pale blue and white light, silver-white hair drifting around a face where many bright eyes opened and watched everything at once. Frost mist circled its form, and holy sparks drifted around its shoulders like silent warning lights. It did not bow to Arjuna, and it did not favor Vance. It only spoke the law that bound this place, and its voice came into the minds of all who stood there. The crown had fractured because force alone could not master truth. The next step would be judged by the balance of the fragments of Dharma, and those shards had to be restored through 4 acts that the battle had so far tried to destroy. Courage, mercy, truth, and restraint were not just words in that moment. They were living rules of the world. If Arjuna failed to awaken them, the frost would spread over mind, heart, and land until every warrior became nothing more than a silent statue of duty. If Vance reached the crown first, he would seal that fate forever. So the war shifted in a single breath from armies to judgment, and Arjuna understood that the deeper trial had arrived at last. Krishna turned his calm gaze toward Arjuna, and his voice was soft but direct, like a hand guiding someone through dark water. He told Arjuna that victory now depended on what he would protect, not what he would break. Arjuna listened because he had come to trust Krishna not as a commander, but as a guide who saw the shape of truth before others could. Arjuna had entered this war believing that skill, courage, and duty would be enough. But the battlefield had already taught him that power without restraint could become another form of frost, because it could freeze the heart just as surely as the crown froze the mind. So when the first wave of cold light rolled across the ground from the fractured crown, Arjuna did not fire at once. He watched it spread, then stepped forward to shield the wounded and the trapped, choosing mercy over pride. That choice awakened the first glowing shard, and one of the fragments of Dharma rose from the ice with gold light in its center. Vance saw it and snarled, because he understood that every shard restored made his control weaker. Thorn answered with a harsh command, and the armored legions surged forward in tight formation. Their shields struck together, spears lowered, boots grinding over frozen stone as they tried to crush Arjuna before the next shard could awaken. The frost wave burst again from the broken crown, sliding low across the ground and turning the air into a biting white haze. But Arjuna moved with a steady rhythm, not wild and not rushed, because Krishna had taught him that restraint could be stronger than panic. He drew one glowing arrow and sent it into the frost line, not to destroy the soldiers, but to split the wave and open a safe path for the trapped allies behind them. That single act of control mattered more than a dozen reckless strikes. The second shard answered it. Then came the harder test. A wounded soldier from the legion fell to one knee, and Arjuna could have left him there, but he did not. He lowered his bow again, spoke a simple truth about the war, and offered the soldier a chance to step away from Vance. That honesty cracked the soldier's fear, and the third shard of Dharma flashed awake with blue-white fire. Even Thorn hesitated for one brief moment, because truth had reached him through the ice. Vance was not finished, and his face changed as he saw the balance turning against him. He raised the frost crown with both hands, and for the first time the broken piece in his grip began to reveal something hidden inside. Beneath the silver rune lines there was a darker seam, a secret chamber that had been sealed long ago by the sky being itself. Inside that chamber rested the final shard, the shard of courage, and it had not been stolen from the world by accident. Vance had found records that said the crown was never meant to rule the frozen land. It was built to test leaders, and only a heart that could release control could awaken its final power. He had ignored that warning because he feared the pain of letting go more than he feared the world around him. That was the twist hidden in the war. Vance had not merely misused the crown. He had been trying to force open a law that only humility could unlock. The sky being had not come to pick a winner. It had come to judge whether anyone on the battlefield could choose balance over domination. And now, as Vance pressed his own will harder against the crown, the final shard trembled between awakening and collapse. Arjuna saw the truth at once, and his calm face changed only a little, because real courage did not always shout. He stepped forward through the frost, lowered his bow completely, and spoke to Vance with a steady voice that carried across the ruined field. He said that fear had driven Vance to build a prison out of silence, but silence was not peace. He said that order without mercy would always become another storm. Then Arjuna did the thing Vance could not imagine. He stopped trying to seize the crown, and instead he opened his hands. He admitted that he could not force the world to heal. He could only stand ready, protect what was fragile, and trust the law that was larger than his own pride. At that moment the final shard of Dharma rose in a burst of pure light, and the crown cracked wider in Vance's grip. The frost wave broke apart, the armored legion staggered back, and Thorn, for the first time, lowered his shield because the frozen rings upon it had lost their power to command him. Vance stared in shock, not because he had been beaten by strength, but because he had been overcome by the one thing he had refused to learn. The sky being descended a little closer, its many eyes bright and unreadable, and the frozen battlefield waited for what came next. Arjuna stood in the center of that waiting silence, changed now not just as a warrior, but as a man who understood that the hardest victory was not taking control. It was knowing when to let truth lead. The war was not over, the crown was not gone, and Vance was not yet broken, but the world had finally begun to turn toward balance, and the next choice would demand even more from every soul still standing there. The frozen battlefield stayed still for one long breath, and that stillness felt heavier than armor. Ice covered the broken ground, pale mist rolled between bent spears, and cold light drifted across the dark sky. Arjuna stood in the center of that silence with his sacred bow held low, his dark brown hair moving softly in the wind, his golden armor shining against the blue robe beneath it. He no longer looked like a young warrior chasing victory at any cost. He looked like a man who had learned that strength without truth could become a chain. Beside him stood Krishna, calm and bright, his dark black hair falling neatly around his face, his yellow and deep blue robes glowing with gold trim as if they held a sunrise inside them. Above them, the sky being floated in a ring of frost mist and holy sparks, its silver-white glowing hair drifting like mist, its tall body made of pale blue and white light, and many bright eyes opening across its face and chest. Farther ahead, Vance stood rigid and cold, his white hair sharp against his black and silver armor, the frost crown shining in his hand with black ice and silver rune lines. Around him, the armored legion waited in tight formation under Thorn, a broad man with gray hair, a black helm with silver edges, and a large shield marked by frozen rings. The central conflict was clear now. If Vance used the frost crown again, he could silence every mantra in the field, crush every act of trust, and freeze the will of every warrior there. If Arjuna failed to answer with wisdom instead of force, the war would spread deeper, the crown would tighten its hold, and the balance of the world would bend toward endless cold. Krishna turned his serene eyes toward Arjuna and spoke with a voice that was calm but never weak. He told Arjuna that Vance was not fighting only for power, even if power was what he chose again and again. Vance feared change. He feared the old order falling apart. He feared that if the crown was taken from him, he would become small, helpless, and forgotten. That fear had driven him to study the frost crown, an ancient ceremonial item forged to silence sacred chants and freeze a warrior will. Vance had not only stolen it for control, he had convinced himself that the world needed hard control to survive. Thorn stood at his side for the same reason. Thorn was not loud and he did not show doubt on his face, but he had followed Vance because he believed order mattered more than mercy. He thought mercy made weakness, and weakness would leave the realm open to collapse. The armored soldiers marched for the same simple reason. They had been told that the only thing standing between them and ruin was the cold shield of the frost crown. That lie had made them obedient. Krishna then lifted his hand, and the 4 fragments of Dharma answered with a soft glow. One shard burned gold for courage, one shone blue for mercy, one gleamed white for truth, and one held steady with the quiet force of restraint. He explained that these fragments were not weapons in the usual sense. They were pieces of balance, made to keep the cosmos from falling into one extreme. The crown was pushing the world towards silence and fear, while the shards could restore choice, honesty, and steady purpose. Arjuna listened, and for the first time since the war began, he did not ask how to win. He asked what must be understood. That question changed the air around him. It did not make him weaker, it made him ready. Then Vance moved, and the frozen field answered with a hiss of sharp cold. He raised the frost crown, and a broad frost wave burst across the battlefield, low and fast, freezing the broken stone, the iron plates, and the edges of the air itself in a pale blue-white glow. The front line of the armored legion advanced behind it, shields locked, spears down, their boots striking the ice in hard, steady beats. Thorn led them without a word, his heavy shield lifted like a wall, his rigid stance never breaking. The frost wave struck the ground near Arjuna and left a sheet of ice racing outward, but Arjuna did not rush forward. Instead, he planted his feet, breathed once, and drew one glowing arrow from his quiver. His face stayed calm, yet his eyes were sharper than before, because he now understood that every move in this battle carried meaning. He did not fire at Vance. He aimed above the front line, toward the sky where the cold mist bent around the power of the crown. Krishna nodded once, and the fragments of Dharma rose into the air behind Arjuna like 4 small stars. The gold shard touched his arrow first, and the shaft glowed with courage. The blue shard softened the glow with mercy. The white shard made the path clear with truth. The final shard gave the arrow restraint so it would strike with purpose and not blind rage. Arjuna released it, and the arrow did not explode. It sang. It cut through the frost mist and struck the space between Vance and his army, breaking the crown light for one small and shocking moment. The armored soldiers faltered because they felt something they had not felt in a long time. They felt choice. That single moment spread fast, and it changed everything around the front line. Some soldiers lowered their spears. Others looked at one another in confusion, as if waking from a hard and icy dream. Thorn saw the break in formation, and for the first time his expression shifted. It was not fear, and it was not anger. It was doubt. He looked at Vance, then at the men under his command, and the rigid wall he had built around himself seemed to crack. Vance noticed at once. His cold eyes narrowed, and his pale face tightened with rage that came from something deeper than insult. He had tied his own value to the frost crown so tightly that any challenge felt like a threat to his very self. He lifted the crown higher, and the black ice flared brighter, as if the artifact itself hungered to silence the field again. But before he could unleash another wave, the sky being descended through the frost mist, its many eyes opening wider, its luminous form pressing the air still. It spoke without loudness, yet every warrior heard it. The voice said that balance could not be forced and truth could not be frozen forever. It reminded Vance that the crown was never meant to rule alone. It was built to test the heart of whoever held it, and it would fail any hand that chose fear over judgment. That revelation struck harder than any blade could have. Vance had believed the crown made him rightful. Instead, it had been revealing his weakness all along. His grip trembled, and the frost crown dimmed for a heartbeat. Arjuna saw that opening, and he stepped forward not as an attacker, but as a man offering one last chance to turn back. He raised his voice and told Vance that the war was already hurting everyone, including the soldiers who followed him. He said the crown could be laid down and the field could still be saved. Vance stared at him, torn between fury and the first crack of shame. The battlefield held its breath again, because everyone there understood that the next choice would decide whether the cold would deepen or begin to break. And as the pale light swirled around Arjuna, Krishna, and the wavering army, the truth had finally come close enough to touch, even if the war itself was not over yet. Vance did not answer right away, and that silence was more dangerous than shouting. His white hair moved in the wind as he lowered the frost crown by a small distance, then lifted it again, fighting against the doubt that had entered him. The soldiers behind Thorn waited for a command that did not come, and the frozen field seemed to listen with them. Arjuna stood still, but he no longer held himself like a man trying to force an ending. He held himself like a guide standing at the edge of a bridge. Krishna remained at his side, his calm face unchanged, because he knew that some battles were won only when a heart was given room to turn. The sky being hovered above the scene, its bright eyes open across its glowing body, and the frost mist around it began to spin in slow circles, as if the sky itself were watching a choice being born. Then Thorn did something no one expected. He stepped one pace forward, lowered his shield, and turned his rigid face toward Vance. He asked a simple question, but it carried great weight. He asked if the soldiers had marched all this way just to become silent statues under a cursed crown. He asked if order without honor still deserved loyalty. His voice was rough yet honest, and it struck the line of troops harder than a shout. Some of the armored men shifted their feet. A few looked toward Arjuna, a few looked toward the frost crown. The army was no longer one solid shape. It was beginning to split into thought. Vance saw that split, and his anger broke open into fear. That fear was the real thing driving him now. Not greed alone, not pride alone. He feared losing control, and he feared being seen as weak after hiding behind cold law for so long. Arjuna understood it at last, and that understanding changed the way he looked at his enemy. He did not excuse Vance, but he no longer saw only a villain. He saw a man who had chosen fear again and again until fear became a prison. The frost crown flashed once more, then dimmed as Vance's hand loosened for one brief moment. The whole battlefield seemed to lean toward that moment, waiting to see whether he would keep falling or begin to rise in a different way. Arjuna lifted his bow, but he did not aim at Vance. He pointed the glowing arrow toward the crown itself, not to destroy it, but to reveal it. Krishna raised the fragments of Dharma above his palm, and their four colors joined in a clear circle of light. Courage, mercy, truth, and restraint met in the air and formed a bright sign that hovered over the frozen ground. The sky being lowered a hand of light, and the frost mist split apart. In that shining space, the crown showed its true nature. It was not just a tool of power. It was a test, and it had always responded to the hidden heart of its holder. Vance had fed it fear, so it had frozen his world. He had fed it control, so it had taught him control would never be enough. That revelation did not end the battle, but it changed its meaning forever. Vance looked at the crown as if seeing it for the first time. Thorn took another breath and waited. The soldiers held their shields half raised, no longer sure who they were meant to follow. Arjuna felt the weight of the next choice pressing on everyone there, and he understood that this was not yet the last stand. This was the turning point before the deeper storm. So he took one step forward through the blue-white ice, his face calm, his heart steady, and his voice ready to speak again, while the battlefield of frozen light held itself open for what would come next. The frozen battlefield stayed quiet for one long breath, and that silence felt heavier than any battle cry. Blue-white ice covered the broken ground, and pale light shimmered over the armor of the soldiers standing in doubt. Arjuna stood at the front with his dark brown hair still neat beneath his calm face, his golden armor bright against the cold, and his sacred bow steady in his left hand. Beside him, Krishna remained still and upright, his black hair falling over his yellow and deep blue robes, his eyes calm, his presence warm in a place that had forgotten warmth. Across the field, Vance watched from a ridge of black ice, his white hair sharp against his dark silver armor, the frost crown glowing in his hand like a piece of winter made into a weapon. He wanted one thing more than victory. He wanted silence. He wanted every warrior to stop trusting courage, stop trusting hope, and kneel under fear. Thorn stood below him, a heavy armored man with gray hair hidden under a black helm, his large shield marked by frozen rings, and his rigid body leading the armored legion forward in perfect lines. The danger was clear to everyone now. If Vance gained full control of the field, the frost crown would hush the voices of the brave, freeze the will of the soldiers, and turn the whole realm into a place where no one would dare resist again. That was why this moment mattered so much, and that was why Arjuna had stepped forward at the edge of the ice, because he knew the battle had reached a deeper place than swords or shields. Arjuna lifted his chin and spoke in a voice that carried across the frozen ground. He did not shout, and he did not threaten. He spoke as a man who knew that fear grows strongest when people stop hearing the truth. He told the soldiers that they were not broken tools, and they were not owned by the frost crown. He said that they still had the power to choose what kind of people they would be when this storm ended. His words moved through the field like a steady flame. Some soldiers lowered their spears a little. Others looked at each other with fresh doubt as if waking from a cold dream. Vance saw this and narrowed his pale eyes. He had not expected Arjuna to speak so openly after all the pain and pressure of the last fight. Vance believed that warriors could only be controlled through pressure, silence, and fear. He had spent so long ruling with cold force that he could no longer understand a heart that stayed calm without surrendering. The frost crown in his hand brightened, and a low frost wave spread out from it, crawling over the ice like a pale tide. It crept across shields, boots, and broken stone, and wherever it touched, the air grew still and sharp. The armored legion raised their heavy shields in unison, and Thorn stepped forward with a hard, measured motion, ready to crush any opening in Arjuna's defense. The whole field tightened again, and the soldiers who had begun to waver now felt the pull of both sides at once. Arjuna could sense it too. This was no longer only a battle of force, it was a battle for belief. Krishna then turned his serene face toward Arjuna, and his voice came quiet but clear. He reminded Arjuna that strength without balance could become another kind of prison. He said that the fragments of Dharma were not prizes for the strongest hand, but living signs of courage, mercy, truth, and restraint. Those 4 sacred shards had appeared earlier in the war, and each one had answered only when a heart was willing to carry more than anger. Arjuna listened, and as he did, the glowing shards that had been resting in the air around the field began to stir again. One shard shone gold with courage, one glowed blue with truth, one burned white with mercy, and one shimmered with a soft, steady light of restraint. Their light did not fight the frost by force. Instead, it cut through the fear that fed the frost. This was the hidden rule that had been revealed little by little during the war. The frost crown could silence mantras only when hearts accepted despair. It could freeze a will only when doubt had already taken root. That was why Vance had been trying to spread confusion from the beginning. He did not just want to conquer land. He wanted to make surrender feel easier than hope. As the shards woke, the sky being appeared above the battlefield in a burst of pale blue and white light. Its tall body floated in the frost mist, silver-white glowing hair flowing around a face and upper body lined with many bright eyes. The divine figure looked down on all of them, not as a judge eager to punish, but as a guardian waiting to see which side would choose balance. The soldiers below stared upward, and even Thorn paused for a heartbeat because the sky itself had answered the growing crisis. Then the first true twist of the battle arrived, and it changed everything. The sky being spoke in a voice that sounded like wind moving through temple bells, and it revealed that the frost crown had once been a ceremonial object built to protect sacred vows, not to crush them. Long ago, it had been made to silence lies during holy rites, so truth could be heard clearly when a kingdom was in danger of breaking its own promise. Vance had found this crown and twisted its purpose. He had used his own fear of disorder to turn it into a tool for control, because he believed that only frozen obedience could keep a world from falling apart. That belief had made him dangerous, but it had also made him blind. He could not see that a kingdom held together by fear would always crack from inside. Arjuna understood this truth at once, and his calm face changed in a small but important way. He no longer saw Vance as a cold wall that had to be smashed. He saw him as a man trapped inside his own terror, and that made the fight harder in one way, but also more clear. Arjuna drew one glowing arrow from his quiver, and Krishna placed a hand near his shoulder without touching him, giving him permission to act with wisdom instead of rage. At the same moment, Thorn raised his shield and signaled the armored legion to close ranks. The soldiers marched forward in a heavy wave, their boots scraping over the ice, and the frost wave rolled out again to support them. The battlefield shuddered under the pressure, yet the shards of Dharma began to circle above Arjuna, one after another, matching his breath, as if waiting for the right moment to join his next move. The air felt stretched tight, and everyone knew that the choice made in the next few heartbeats would shape the rest of the war. Arjuna took another step across the blue-white ice, and this time the step carried more than courage. It carried understanding. He called out to the soldiers in the armored legion, and he told them that Vance had hidden the truth from them. He said they were not marching to save the realm, they were marching to protect Vance from the fear he could not face in himself. That message struck deep, because many of the soldiers had never truly understood why they were fighting. Some had been forced by rank, some had followed habit, some had feared what would happen if they refused. Now they heard for the first time that their loyalty had been built on control, not trust. A few shields lowered, a few spears shook. Thorn turned his head slightly, and for one brief moment, emotion seemed to touch his empty face. He had always seemed like a machine of war, but now the truth reached him too. He had not joined Vance because he loved cold conquest. He had joined because he feared the chaos of a realm without rules. That fear had made him hard, silent, and obedient. Arjuna saw that opening, and Krishna saw it too. The mentor and the warrior moved together without a spoken order. Krishna lifted one hand, and the blue and white light around the fragments of Dharma intensified. Arjuna released his arrow, but it did not strike with violence alone. It carried courage to the front line, truth into the ranks, mercy into the hearts of those who had been misled, and restraint into the hands of those who still wanted to keep fighting. The arrow split into 4 light paths, and each path touched a different shard. Together they formed a circle of sacred balance above the field. Vance reacted at once, lifting the frost crown high and forcing one final frost wave across the ground. Ice rushed outward, and for a terrible second it seemed the whole battlefield might be swallowed by cold silence. But the circle of Dharma held. The wave broke against it, shattered into drifting frost, and the armored legion staggered back, driven into confusion by a power they could not understand or control. Vance did not fall, and he did not surrender. He stepped back only one pace, his face stiff with shock and anger, and the frost crown flickered for the first time. The silence had cracked. The sky being drifted lower, its many eyes bright with solemn light, and the frost mist around it began to thin. It did not claim victory for anyone. Instead, it revealed the next truth that would guide the coming struggle. The sacred shards could not destroy the frost crown while it was still fed by fear, and Arjuna could not end the war by force alone. The crown had to be separated from the lies around it, and the soldiers had to choose freely before the field could be truly saved. This was the deeper storm that had been waiting beyond the turning point, and now everyone could see it clearly. Vance clenched the crown in both hands, his pale eyes locked on Arjuna, and his voice came low and sharp. He accused Arjuna of trying to weaken the only order that remained. He said chaos would return if control was lost. Arjuna answered with the same calm that had carried him through every trial so far. He said order built on fear was only a cage, and a cage was not peace. Krishna stood beside him like a steady candle in the dark, and the glow of the fragments of Dharma made the frozen ground shine in 4 colors. Thorn slowly turned his shield away from Arjuna and toward Vance, not as an act of rebellion yet, but as a sign that his certainty had cracked. The legion itself began to divide in small ways, with some soldiers backing away from the frost wave and others looking to Arjuna for the first time with real hope. The battle was not over, the deeper storm was still rising, but Arjuna had changed now. He was no longer only a warrior who struck back. He had become a leader who could see the fear inside his enemy, the doubt inside his allies, and the sacred balance that stood above both. As the frozen battlefield waited for the next move, Arjuna held his bow in a steady hand. Krishna watched the sky. Vance tightened his grip on the failing crown, and the entire realm stood on the edge of whatever would come next. The frozen field lay silent under a black sky, and the cold air felt almost alive. Broken stone, shattered banners, and sheets of ice stretched in every direction, while pale light moved across the ground like a slow breath. Arjuna stood at the center of that frozen ruin, his dark brown hair stirred by the wind, his golden armor bright against the blue robe beneath it, and his sacred bow held low but ready. Beside him stood Krishna, with dark black hair falling neatly over his yellow and deep blue robes, his calm face unchanged even as the storm above them kept twisting. Far across the ice, Vance waited in black and silver armor, his white hair sharp against the dark sky, and the frost crown in his hand gave off a cold glow that made the air around it tremble. Thorn stood near him like a wall, his gray hair hidden beneath a black helm, his shield marked by frozen rings, and his face as hard as iron. The central danger was plain now. If Vance spread the frost crown across the field again, the crown would silence the mantras of the defenders, freeze their will, and let the armored legion push the whole realm into obedience. If Arjuna failed to stop it, the balance of courage, mercy, truth, and restraint would be lost, and the realm would remain trapped under fear for many long years. Arjuna did not rush forward this time because he no longer believed speed was the same as strength. He watched the enemy lines, then he watched the men beside them, and he saw more than armor and weapons. He saw soldiers who marched because they were afraid of Vance. He saw Thorn holding his post without emotion, not because he loved the cold, but because he had spent too many years obeying orders and no longer knew how to stop. He even saw the crack in Vance himself, a narrow but real line of doubt hidden behind the cold eyes. Krishna noticed Arjuna studying the field, and he spoke in a quiet voice that carried through the wind. He said that power could break chains for a moment, but only understanding could break them for good. He also said that the frost crown did not create fear from nothing. It made fear louder, then turned that fear into silence. That was why Vance used it. He believed the world was already too divided, too loud, and too weak to heal itself. So he decided that if everyone could not agree, then everyone would be forced to stillness. It was a cruel answer, but it was still an answer born from fear, and that made it more dangerous than simple hatred. Then the storm above the battlefield changed, and the change felt like a warning. A deep light opened between the clouds, and a sky being descended into view, tall and luminous, with silver-white glowing hair and many bright eyes opening across a body made of pale blue and white light. Frost mist drifted around the being, and holy sparks rose and fell like tiny stars. The soldiers on both sides froze in place because no one on that field had expected a divine witness to appear so clearly. The sky being did not speak at first. It only looked down at the shattered ground, the fighting ranks, the crown, and Arjuna himself. Then 4 sacred lights rose from the center of the battlefield, hidden until that moment beneath the ice. They were the fragments of Dharma, and each shard shone with a different truth. One burned with courage, one held mercy, one carried truth, one held restraint. Their glow was not gentle, but it was clear, and every person there could feel that the shards were not weapons. They were judges. Krishna explained that the realm had not sent the shards to reward victory alone. The shards appeared when a leader faced a choice that could protect balance or destroy it. Arjuna understood at once that the battle was no longer only about winning. It was about proving whether he could hold all 4 truths at the same time. Vance saw the shards and his face tightened. For the first time, his cold control slipped enough for the others to notice. He raised the frost crown higher, and a broad frost wave burst across the ground in a pale blast of icy energy. The wave swept over broken stone and raced toward Arjuna, freezing the battlefield in a wide white line. It struck shields, armor, and the air itself, and the front ranks of the armored legion advanced behind it with heavy steps. Thorn led them in perfect formation, his shield up, his body like a moving gate, and his voice flat as he ordered the push forward. But Arjuna did not answer with a storm of arrows right away. He stepped forward, planted his feet, and raised his bow in a steady line. Then he spoke to the field, not with rage, but with a voice that carried clear and firm. He called on the soldiers to look at one another, not just at their orders. He said the crown was feeding on their fear, and fear was making them march against people who were not their true enemy. That moment mattered because it reached the crack in the armor of the legion. Some soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their spears. One man near the front turned his head as if hearing his own thoughts for the first time in years. Thorn saw the break in formation and moved to crush it, but Krishna lifted one hand, and a ring of soft gold light held the front line for a breath longer. That single breath gave Arjuna the opening he needed, and one glowing arrow flew forward, not to destroy, but to strike the frost wave at its center and split it apart. The wave shattered into cold sparks, and the battle changed in an instant. Vance staggered back one step, shocked that the crown had failed so openly. He did not understand at first that the fragments of Dharma were answering Arjuna, not by making him stronger alone, but by making his choices sharper. Courage without mercy would have only created more fear. Mercy without truth would have allowed Vance to keep lying. Truth without restraint would have burned the field with more violence. So Arjuna held all four together as best he could, and the shards floated closer around him like a circle of judgment. Then came the twist that changed everything. The sky being finally spoke, and its voice sounded like wind over ice, deep and clear. It revealed that Vance had once been chosen to guard the crown, not to rule with it. The frost crown had been made to quiet a great curse in the old age, but Vance had learned to use its silence as control. He had not simply found power and grown cruel. He had been trusted with a sacred burden, then had twisted that burden into a prison for everyone else because he was terrified that without control, the realm would collapse. This truth shook the field because it showed that Vance was not fighting only for conquest. He was fighting to protect his own broken belief that order mattered more than freedom. Arjuna looked at him and understood that defeating him with force alone would not end the wound. The real battle was now about breaking the lie inside Vance before it froze the whole realm forever. Vance reacted with anger, but it was the anger of a man whose fear had been named aloud. He drove the frost crown down into the air, and a second wave of cold rushed out, stronger and lower, trying to bury the field in silence. The armored legion surged with it, and Thorn advanced like a locked door in motion. The sky being watched from above, bright and still, while Krishna moved to Arjuna's side and reminded him that restraint was not weakness. It was the power to stop at the right moment. Arjuna breathed once, then again, and he made a choice that changed him forever. He did not aim at Vance's heart, and he did not try to crush the legion. Instead, he aimed at the crown itself and at the fear that held Vance to it. His arrow split into 4 lights in flight, each one carrying one fragment of Dharma, and each one struck the crown with a separate truth. Courage broke the old silence. Mercy softened the hard ice. Truth exposed the lie of control. Restraint kept the blast from swallowing the field. The frost crown cracked, not into ruin, but into unstable light, and Vance screamed in shock as the power surged out of his grasp. The frost wave collapsed around the front ranks, and the armored legion stumbled back, driven into confusion. Thorn planted his shield to hold the line, but even he could not keep the formation steady now. Arjuna then stepped closer, not as a conqueror but as a leader, and he told Vance that order built on fear would always fail. He offered him a chance to let go before the crown consumed the last of his choices. Vance did not answer at once. His white hair whipped in the storm, his eyes flicked from Arjuna to the broken crown, and for the first time he looked less like a tyrant and more like a man standing at the edge of his own mistake. The battlefield did not end there. The sky still rumbled, the shards still glowed, and the deeper storm was still rising. But now Arjuna stood ready not only to fight, but to guide what came next, while Krishna watched in silence, knowing that the next move would decide whether the realm learned balance or fell deeper into cold. The frozen battlefield still held its breath under a broken sky, and the wind moved like a living thing across shattered stone and half-buried shields. Frost clung to every surface, but it no longer looked steady, because the glow inside the shattered crown was starting to flicker in uneasy pulses. Arjuna stood near the center of that ruin, his dark brown hair stirred by the cold wind, his golden armor marked by frost, and his sacred bow held low but ready. Beside him, Krishna remained calm and still, his dark black hair falling against his yellow and deep blue robes, his face peaceful even as the storm groaned above them. Ahead of them, Vance stood with his white hair lifting in the wind, his black and silver armor shining with sharp frost lines, and the frost crown in his hand now looked less like a symbol of power and more like a wound that refused to close. The central danger was clear now, because if the crown broke in the wrong way, the silence it cast over the battlefield would spread into the land itself, freezing courage, turning soldiers into empty shells, and leaving the realm trapped under Vance's fear forever. Vance did not speak at first because the moment had changed him more than any blade or arrow could. His cold, pale eyes moved from Arjuna to the crown fragments, and for the first time his rigid face showed something cracked and human. He had not built his power only to rule, but to silence the fear that had haunted him since the first winter famine took his home, his family, and his trust in mercy. He had come to believe that if he could freeze every voice of doubt, then he could make the world safe at last. That belief had driven him to gather the armored legion, led by the heavy-built Thorn with his gray hair hidden beneath a black helm with silver edges, and to march them across the frozen battlefield in tight formation. Thorn was not cruel in the way Vance was cruel, but he was loyal to order, and he followed the Frost command because he believed chaos always won when people hesitated. Now he looked from the fallen shards to the dark sky, and even he seemed to understand that the plan was breaking apart. The frost wave had already weakened the ground, yet the deeper storm above had not stopped. It had only grown larger, as if the sky itself was waiting for one final choice. Arjuna saw that choice before anyone else, and he stepped forward with the calm of a man who had learned to hold his fear instead of hiding it. He was not only a warrior now, but a guide, and that mattered because strength without guidance would only feed the same cold that had already spread across the field. He raised his sacred bow, then lowered it again because Krishna had taught him that the right answer was not always the fastest one. Krishna finally spoke, and his voice was steady and simple, carrying through the wind like a clear path in deep snow. He told Arjuna that the fragments of Dharma were not trophies and they were not weapons for pride. They were sacred shards of balance, each one holding a part of the whole that kept power from becoming ruin. Courage gave people the strength to begin. Mercy kept that strength from becoming cruelty. Truth cut through lies. Restraint stopped victory from turning into greed. The sky rumbled as Krishna explained this, and the meaning of the battle became sharper than ever because Vance had not only stolen power, he had torn balance apart and used silence to cover the damage. If the shards were restored in the wrong way, the storm would keep feeding on fear. If they were restored with wisdom, the frost could finally lose its hold. Then the air changed, and every soldier on both sides looked upward. A shape began to form inside the glowing cloud bank, first like a pale light, then like a living figure made of silver white glow, blue mist, and holy sparks. The sky being had awakened at last. It hovered above the battlefield with multiple bright eyes opening across its face and upper body, and its presence made even the armored legion hesitate. This was not another enemy in the simple sense. It was a judge of balance, a divine force drawn by the broken crown and the scattered shards. Its arrival revealed a truth that no one had named out loud until now. The frost crown had never truly been only a tool of control. It had once been built as a seal, meant to keep a deeper storm spirit from entering the realm through the northern skies. Vance had found the crown, learned part of its use, and then twisted it to silence others instead of protecting them. That was why the battlefield kept widening with cold, and that was why the storm above still swelled. The seal was failing, not because the crown was broken alone, but because it had been fed with selfish purpose. Vance stared upward in shock, and his hand tightened around the shattered black ice of the crown as the truth struck him harder than any strike could. He had not been ruling the frost. He had been feeding the break. Arjuna understood at once what had to happen next, but the path was dangerous and uncertain. The 4 fragments of Dharma had to be brought together not by force but by trust. He moved toward the nearest shard, a bright piece of gold and white energy lying near a cracked shield, and as he reached for it, the shard responded to his calm hand rather than his power. The second shard, glowing blue, hovered near a fallen spear, then drifted toward Krishna, who held out his palm without moving a step. The third shard of radiant truth rested on the edge of the broken crown itself, and Vance saw it there, trembling like a mirror he had avoided for too long. The fourth shard, the one of restraint, remained in the snow between the lines of the armored legion and the heroes, as if it waited for the one choice that could stop the storm without feeding it. Thorn raised his shield and ordered his soldiers to brace, but none of them moved forward. Even they could feel that the field had become sacred ground, and any wrong attack would only make the cold stronger. Arjuna called to Vance with a voice that was firm but not angry. He told him that power was not the same as safety, and control was not the same as peace. He said that if Vance wanted the realm to survive, then he had to help restore what he had broken. For a long moment Vance said nothing, and the silence around him was more dangerous than any roar. Then, with a slow and shaking breath, he admitted the truth in front of everyone. He had chosen silence because he feared being powerless again. He had used the frost crown because it made people obey before they could disagree. He had told himself that strict control would protect the realm, but in truth it had only protected his own pain. The admission did not erase what he had done, and it did not make the battle easy, but it changed the shape of the struggle. Arjuna saw the opening, and Krishna gave the smallest nod because the real battle was now inside the choices of the people on the field. The sky being lowered one luminous hand, and the fourth shard finally lifted from the snow. It drifted between Arjuna, Krishna, and Vance, glowing brighter with every honest word spoken nearby. Yet the storm above answered with a violent pulse, and a wall of frost rushed down from the cloud line, driven by the broken seal and the fear still buried in the crown. The armored legion formed a barrier around Vance, not to protect his pride, but because even they could feel that the next moment would decide whether the realm began to heal or was buried under endless cold. Arjuna pulled back his bowstring not to strike a person, but to guide the shard toward the right place, while Krishna raised his hand toward the sky and the divine light gathered around him. The 4 pieces of Dharma shone in separate colors, each one waiting, each one demanding balance, and the sky rumbled louder as the story moved toward its next impossible step. The frozen battlefield held its breath under a black sky, and the air shook with cold light. Arjuna stood in golden armor, calm and focused, while Krishna beside him raised one steady hand toward the storm. Around them, the fragments of Dharma glowed in 4 colors, and the whole realm waited to see if balance would return or vanish forever. Vance, a white-haired man in black and silver armor, lifted the frost crown with both hands. He wanted the world to stay silent, because silence made people obey, and obedience fed his power. Thorn, a broad gray-haired man in heavy armor, led the armored legion forward with locked shields and frozen spears, because he believed only harsh rule could protect a broken land. Then the frost wave rolled out from the crown, low and wide, and every stone it touched turned bright with ice. Arjuna did not fire at Vance. He pulled his bowstring to guide the nearest shard because he understood the real fight was not force but placement. Krishna spoke a soft mantra, and divine light rose around the fragments, helping each one find its proper place. Courage answered courage, mercy answered mercy, truth met truth, and restraint held the others in balance. The sky being above them opened more glowing eyes, and its silver-white hair shone through the frost mist as it judged the moment in silence. Then came the twist that changed everything. Vance had never wanted the frost crown to rule alone. He had used it to hide his fear that the realm would fall apart without a hard hand, but the crown had slowly frozen his own heart first. When Krishna raised the final shard, the crown cracked with a sharp flash, and the frost wave broke apart before it could cover the field. Thorn stopped his march, lowered his shield, and saw that mercy did not mean weakness. The 4 fragments joined at last, and a warm light spread across the battlefield like sunrise through winter clouds. The armored legion stepped back, no longer forced by fear, and the ice on the ground began to melt in clear streams. Arjuna lowered his bow with quiet relief, and Krishna smiled with the gentle strength of a true guide. By the end, the realm was not just saved, but healed, and Arjuna finally understood that balance was not about perfect control. It was about trust, courage, and the choice to let light lead.